Here's the thing about working overtime in industrial sales. You brace for paper jams or a scanner throwing a tantrum. You don't brace for overhearing your wife mapping out date nights that don't include you. But one late shift gave me exactly that. I'd been grinding 65 to 70-hour weeks, stashing every extra dollar into what I called the Subaru Fund, trying to replace her glitchy transmission with something safer. Apparently, while I was planning for her new ride, she was planning her new life. And that's where my very unglamorous job comes into the picture. Meet the man who fixes conveyors, not marriages. I'm 34, and while some of my peers pitch apps or flip houses, I deal in conveyor belts. Not the airport kind you see hauling luggage, but the unglamorous workhorses in warehouses. They're invisible until they stop moving, and then suddenly, everyone acts like the world's about to collapse. I've been with the same company for 8 years, starting in inside sales and working my way up to regional manager. So yeah, it's not flashy, but I've poured a big chunk of my life into it. A typical day doesn't look like much from the outside. Emails and calls from plant managers who sound like a red warning light could bankrupt their entire operation. But the truth is, when a packaging line goes down, every minute really does cost thousands of dollars. That means being on call nights, weekends, whenever something breaks. More times than I can count, I've found myself in some echoing warehouse at 2 a.m. with the scanner beeping at me like it's mocking my existence. That's the job. Not glamorous, just relentless. People like to call that kind of grind hardworking, but it doesn't feel like hard work in some noble sense. It feels like erosion, a slow grind that wears you down. The hours eat away at your energy, at your presence elsewhere. I used to joke that forklifts saw me more than my wife did. At first, we both laughed. After a while, I noticed I was the only one still laughing. The irony is, I convinced myself those hours meant I was being responsible, the kind of man who provided before being asked. Reliability wasn't just part of my job description, it became my whole identity. My version of flowers or love notes wasn't anything romantic. It was making sure warranties were current and bank accounts were stable. I thought that was proof of love. For me, spreadsheets and overtime hours were an investment in our life together. For her, it just looked like absence. So, why did I keep saying yes every time there was an opportunity to pick up extra work? Simple. She wanted a new car. I told myself the long nights, the extra shifts, the vending machine dinners. Those were all temporary sacrifices to give her something reliable. In my head, I was demonstrating devotion one time card at a time. In reality, my devotion was misdirected. I wasn't around in the ways that mattered, but I could quote you the expected lifespan of a belt roller from memory. Here's the part that really stings. I always thought responsibility is what kept marriages together. Keep the bills paid, keep the house standing, keep a cushion in savings. From the outside, it worked. The numbers on the mortgage dropped. The credit score climbed. But inside our house, conversations shrank to sticky notes left on the fridge. By the time I noticed how thin our connection had become, all I could do was rationalize it. It's temporary, I told myself. Things will get better after the next promotion, after the next payoff. But people don't wait the way machinery does. You can shut down a belt line until someone fixes it. Marriages don't come with a pause button. The truth is, I thought my work ethic was a gift. She saw it as a void. I mistook predictability for security when to her it was just monotony. I believed every overtime shift was building points in an invisible account of loyalty. Turns out that account didn't matter if the statement didn't match hers. Looking back now, the warning signs weren't hidden. Late nights grew into late weeks. The silence between us grew heavier. But I pressed on, convinced responsibility alone could carry a relationship. In reality, it just left me tired enough not to notice what was slipping away. And that brings us to the turning point. Because all that responsibility, all that well-intentioned overtime, wasn't just about my career anymore. It was about something she wanted, something new she'd been talking about more and more often. The Subaru dream versus the marriage loop crash. Her focus locked onto a Subaru Outback like it was the missing puzzle piece of her life. The complaints about her 2019 sedan started as passing remarks. Stalling here, a transmission slip there, but soon it sounded like she was describing a medical emergency every time she turned the key. Each drive to work, according to her, was a gamble against fate. For someone whose job involved conveyor belts pulling thousands of pounds a day without issue, her car. Dramatic sounded exaggerated. Still, she started flooding my phone with dealership listings, always the same line, certified pre-owned Subaru Outbacks, priced right around $28,000. The Outback became less of a car and more of a symbol, her promise of peace of mind, her escape from uncertainty. And because I was wired to respond to problems by fixing them, I swallowed the whole story. If stability was what she wanted, then stability was what I would build. I didn't stop to ask if the math made sense. I just opened the throttle at work. That meant 65, 70-hour weeks stretching over 2 solid months. Nights, weekends, emergencies, it didn't matter. Every extra checkmark on the time card was one more step toward crossing that dealership parking lot. In my head, every call I answered, every warehouse I stayed in past midnight was for the Subaru. After the first 12 weeks of relentless overtime, I had built up about $12,000 in what I half-jokingly called the Subaru Fund. 12 grand felt like something real, even if it was still less than half the sticker price. What I didn't notice then was the irony. I was breaking myself down in order to buy a car famous for not breaking down. I fixed conveyor lines in plants that couldn't afford downtime, trying desperately to buy her reliability on wheels. All the while, her reliability as a partner was quietly collapsing. My sacrifices became invisible at home. She complained about her old car misfiring, but never once saw how I was misfiring too, coming home exhausted, running on gas station food, barely present. I thought I was proving devotion shift by shift. She saw absence. I can look back now and see just how absurd it was. I pictured a cinematic reveal, her standing in a driveway, keys in hand, radio blasting, finally getting everything she wanted because I'd made it possible. Instead, she was staging her own secret reveal, only without the happy ending. While I collected overtime slips like lottery tickets, she was collecting excuses, rehearsing new plans. She wanted dependability in a car, not in me. The Subaru became her dream, while our marriage slid into the ditch. The strangest part was how convincing the dream felt while I was inside it. Each time she texted me another link to a certified pre-owned listing, I felt it as confirmation that my work mattered. This wasn't pointless drudgery, it was targeted sacrifice. That thought kept me upright when my eyelids wanted to close at a broken scanner or when I found myself nodding off at red lights. I convinced myself that once she had her reliable car, the small cracks in our marriage, her frustrations, the silences would patch themselves, as though a warranty slip would somehow be proof that I understood her needs. One well-placed Subaru slogan ran through my head and stuck. It wasn't funny at the time, but later the humor set in. She insisted on a symbol of loyalty from a car lot, while her loyalty was the very thing missing. Meanwhile, my life outside of work shrank. Co-workers remarked that they saw me more than my spouse. They laughed when I showed up bleary-eyed again and again, but it wasn't far from the truth. Every weekend call I answered, every night shift I picked up, it wasn't because the company demanded it. I demanded it of myself. I believed her happiness sat on a dealership lot with four-wheel drive and an extended warranty. Never mind the fact that all the spreadsheets and savings projections I compiled were for someone who wasn't saving anything for me. The cruel symmetry of it all is impossible to ignore now. She demanded a newer car because her old one made her anxious. Too many slips, too much unpredictability. But in our marriage, her own choices were 10 times more volatile. While I tried to buy her reliability, she made herself unreliable. Stability mattered, but only in the driver's seat. Commitment was a feature she wanted from a machine, not from her husband. If marketing was honest, Subaru would have stolen my life story for a commercial. Forget the sweeping mountain roads and acoustic guitars. Imagine my reality. A husband grinding 70-hour weeks to buy the world's most reliable car for an unreliable marriage. Freeze frame, voiceover, the Subaru Outback. More dependable than your spouse. That would have nailed it. Eventually, the realization landed, though not while the money piled up. Not while I worked through the exhaustion believing our relationship was being repaired mile by mile. No, it only hit later when everything came apart. By then, the numbers told the punchline clearly. I had forced myself through 8 weeks of 70-plus hours to scrape together $12,000, less than half the cost of the dream she built her hopes around. I thought it was an investment in us. She thought it was her ticket out. Even the details haunt me in retrospect. She used to describe her old transmission problems, like she was narrating a metaphor I couldn't decode at the time. Slips, stalls, gears grinding. I thought it was mechanical. It wasn't. Those same words described our relationship more accurately than the sedan. While I tried to hold it together with overtime and denial, she was already thinking about how to replace it altogether. So the Subaru wasn't just about a car. It was a test of how much I was willing to stretch myself in the name of responsibility. It revealed that I measured love in hours worked, in dollars saved. She measured it in something else entirely. And when her balance sheet didn't match mine, she went looking for a new deal. That's the part that stings, even as it makes me laugh now. I thought I was writing a story about loyalty and effort rewarded. What I was actually writing was a setup for a joke, one where the car was reliable, but the marriage wasn't. And while I was so focused on proving myself useful, dependable, capable, I was blind to how little any of that mattered to her. Looking back, I can see that the signs were all there. I just didn't recognize them, which makes me think about how it all began. Because sometimes the way a story starts already tells you how it's going to end if you know how to read the signals. I didn't. The warning signs were there from the very beginning. Trivia night, the red flag they ignored. We first crossed paths at a brewery trivia night. On paper, it sounded like the kind of story people like to tell years later. Quirky setting, casual competition, a meet-cute that almost wrote itself. The host had a habit of forcing dad jokes onto the crowd. The tables were sticky with years of spilled lager, and everyone took the questions a little more seriously than they'd admit. I wasn't there to dominate trivia. I was a tag-along with my friends, more interested in beer flights than bonus rounds. She came in with her own group, sharp-eyed, pen ready like she was going to war. When the trivia kicked off, the categories tilted hard toward pop culture, music charts, TV catchphrases, movie releases. For me, that was foreign territory. I could tell you torque ratings and efficiency numbers for machinery, but I couldn't name the pop star who topped the 2007 Billboard charts to save my life. She, on the other hand, answered like she had the questions in advance. Song titles, sitcom quotes, movie dates. She barely paused before chiming in. My input? A wildly wrong guess about a film release year that landed me 6 years off. By the time final tallies came, her team had buried us at the bottom of the scoreboard. She walked past our table afterward, smiling just enough to make the loss staying in feel magnetic at the same time. My friends pushed me to say something, so I did. I congratulated her, joking that her team must have been cheating. She laughed, teased me about my wrong answers, and we fell into that easy back and forth, her wit a little cutting, my self-deprecation doing most of the heavy lifting. That was the actual start of us. She shined brightest when there were details to capture. I leaned into playing the fool who missed them. At the time, it felt charming. The truth is that trivia night revealed more than either of us realized. It showed just how tuned in she was to the little things. Lyrics, jokes, cultural touchstones, while I could breeze past anything outside my narrow lane. That contrast sounded like balance in the moment. She was quick with pop culture facts. I could supply warehouse trivia nobody wanted to hear. People love to think opposites attract. In this case, though, it wasn't balance. It was a blueprint. From day one, she thrived on catching what others overlooked, and I had a tendency to miss what was right in front of me. At the beginning, her mismatched expertise was funny to both of us. She'd rattle off celebrity gossip. I'd counter with conveyor belt lifespan statistics. She teased me for being hopeless with trivia topics everyone else seemed to know. And I wore it like part of my personality. That's just me. I noticed technical things, not the obvious stuff. In hindsight, it's almost humiliating. What I thought was harmless banter was actually a preview of how blind I'd be to the things that mattered most later on. From that night forward, the dynamic felt established. She had a way of taking control in social situations, confident in her recall, always a few steps ahead. I leaned into being laid back, shrugging off what I didn't know. It made me seem easygoing at the trivia table, but in a relationship it meant one of us tracked every cue, while the other one assumed everything was fine. That contrast never really went away. What stood out most about her that night wasn't just her answers, it was how much she liked being right, how much she liked proving she had seen something quicker than everyone else. There was this spark of satisfaction in her expressions when she nailed a question. I found it magnetic. But years later, I can admit, that same need to stay 3 steps ahead played a role in exactly where things landed. For me, trivia night is unavoidably symbolic. I learned a small but telling fact about myself. I could laugh at not knowing things most people considered obvious. She learned she liked being the person who never missed. Between us, that turned into a pattern that first felt playful, then later became a wedge. She wanted presence and attention. I substituted persistence and provision. She gave hints clear as multiple choice answers. I acted like the question hadn't been asked. What was funny at a brewery table ended up foreshadowing years of disconnect. Looking back now, I can't see that night as just a meet cute. It was too telling to be shrugged off. The scoreboard declared her a winner, but more than that, it silently predicted how much of our story would revolve around one of us staying alert while the other drifted. I missed trivia questions then, and I missed more important signals later. At the time, I thought that gap was harmless, even complimentary. In reality, it was already shaping the way we interacted and setting me up to miss what I couldn't afford to ignore. That's the lens everything else fits into. She was sharp with the details in small, meaningless games. I was convinced details only mattered if they involved gears or parts numbers. It sounds lighthearted when you frame it around bar trivia, but that misalignment carried through everywhere else. And while it looked cute in the beginning, her quick answers, my clumsy guesses, in the long run, it built into something lopsided. And that's how our first night together really mattered, not because of the scorecard or the jokes, but because it showed us exactly who we were going to be. She was the one noticing everything, I was the one missing everything, and both of us thought that was fine. The trivia sheets went in the trash, but the roles stuck around. And when life shifted away from questions about sitcoms and bands into things that quietly mattered more, time spent together, conversations that needed listening, I carried the same blind spot. I worked hard, thought devotion was measured in hours and dollars, but couldn't see what she was quietly asking for. Trivia night wasn't just the opening scene. It was the first demonstration of a pattern I never adjusted. She had the answers, I shrugged at the questions. And that approach shaped everything that came after. It's strange to say trivia night changed anything, because it was just an evening at a brewery. But if I'm honest, it was less of a beginning and more of a forecast. A night where the score wasn't just about the answers on the paper, it was about the way we view the world. And once you know that, it makes everything that followed a lot easier to understand. That sense of imbalance didn't end at the trivia table. It carried everywhere, including into the way I handled work. Because just like trivia, my career demanded awareness, fast responses, and care for the details. The irony? I managed to do all of that for conveyor belts, but never figured out how to bring the same vigilance home. Overtime, hero mode, or glorified maintenance. If there's one thing I learned working in industrial equipment sales, it's that downtime is treated like a national emergency. A conveyor freezes, or a scanner fails mid-shift, and the clock immediately starts bleeding money, thousands of dollars disappearing every lost hour. That urgency was my reality, and it's why I defaulted to hero mode every time the phone buzzed. While other people could let calls roll to voicemail, my instinct was to grab my keys. No cape, no gadgets, just steel-toed boots, fluorescent warehouse lights, and endless hours making sure boxes kept moving. Overtime became my second skin. For about 2 months straight, I said yes to everything. Weekend calls, late nights, filling in when colleagues were sick or on vacation. The industrial world doesn't sleep line wasn't just a saying. It was the rule book we all lived by. I logged 65 to 70 hours a week without blinking, building what I thought was our path to stability. Each shift felt urgent, like the fate of a whole operation balanced on whether a barcode scanner beeped correctly. On paper, I was delivering small victories, saving plants thousands, and keeping operations running. But all those extra hours came straight out of my personal life. At first, I told myself this was noble. I worked myself to exhaustion, to build a cushion, to save for the car she wanted, to ease financial pressure. Income climbed, paychecks looked healthier, savings started stacking. But inside the house, something very different was happening. Time together shrank like a glacier melting in plain sight. Dinner became something she ate alone. Conversations were traded for silence, and I barely noticed. Every hour I rescued a packaging line, I was losing ground at home. That's the hidden equation of overtime nobody likes to talk about. On one column, you've got the company ledger, emergency solved, crisis avoided, dollars preserved. On the other column, you've got your marriage, empty space at the table, new habits forming without you, emotional drift that doesn't get logged anywhere visible. The two ledgers exist in the same time, but they don't balance each other out. One fills while the other drains. I didn't see it at first because fatigue glossed over the losses. When you're worn down, silence feels normal. Her sighs felt like background noise. Empty glasses in the sink? Just clutter, not signs of hours I wasn't there for. There were times I half convinced myself that the grind was romantic in a different way, that she'd look back someday and realize how hard I worked. I imagined her appreciating the sacrifices, seeing reliability as proof of love. But the truth was, sacrifice didn't register the way I thought. To her, every extra shift looked less like devotion and more like absence. She didn't want a provider who lived in warehouses. She wanted a partner who showed up in her daily life. That gap probably spoke louder than anything I said out loud. The more I pushed into hero mode at work, the more it looked like I was choosing machinery over marriage. If the scanner light blinked red, I responded like it was a house fire. If she gave quiet hints about growing lonely, I missed it, excusing my lack of presence as temporary. I believed balance would return when the overtime stopped, when the Subaru Fund was ready. But balance doesn't work like that. It tips faster than you think, and by the time you notice, it's already skewed beyond repair. Looking back, I see how silly my pride was. I wore reliability like a badge, answering every midnight call, every "we need you now" text, like it validated my worth. But the validation only echoed inside warehouses. At home, it was invisible. I thought each hour logged was a brick in the foundation of our shared future, when really, those hours were just bricks removing me from it. That's the trick of overwork. The energy creates something very real in one world, while quietly dismantling another in parallel. I sometimes pictured myself as a kind of martyr, every shift another testament to how much I cared. In practice, it wasn't selfless, heroic. It was self-erasure. Piece by piece, I cut myself out of my own marriage. I handled breakdowns and equipment while ignoring the breakdown right in my kitchen. And because I framed fatigue as temporary necessity, I never stopped long enough to recognize the permanence of what was slipping away. Even the math tells its own kind of dark joke. Over 2 months, I banked about $12,000 for the car fund. It was supposed to show that I listened, that I responded to what mattered to her. Meanwhile, those same shifts gave her space and freedom to start making other plans entirely, plans I didn't know about until it was much too late. I thought I was proving I could deliver what she wanted most. But the time I sacrificed to get there created the exact void that let betrayal grow. What makes it sting more is how ordinary it all felt while I was inside of it. Nights at a warehouse desk, vending machine dinners, messages from her saying she understood the hours, all of it wrapped into what I thought was responsibility. I didn't see the irony until hindsight sharpened everything. I was securing money while bankrupting intimacy. Loyalty defined me at work, but it left me blind at home. The part nobody warns you about is how easy it is to normalize fatigue. Exhaustion turns real problems into background static. It convinces you that marriage is fine because you're too tired to admit otherwise. You start living on autopilot, mistaking stability at work for stability in life. But stability built on absence is anything but. Eventually, someone notices the distance, and if it isn't you, it'll be them. In the end, the story of my overtime isn't about heroics. It's about misplaced devotion. Machine stopped crashing because I stepped in. My marriage crashed because I didn't. It's not a heroic trade-off. It's a lopsided account that left me invested in the wrong side of the ledger. Every unpaid domestic hour compounded interest I couldn't calculate until it hit me all at once, and that balance sheet always comes due. For me, the reality of it surfaced on a night I never expected. I wasn't supposed to be home when I was. My schedule was predictable to the minute, almost scripted. But on one of those rare exceptions, everything came into sharp focus, the kind of focus fatigue had stolen from me for months. That was when the real story began to surface, not under warehouse lights, but in my own house. The night of the not-so-quiet return. Coming home early was almost unheard of for me. Most nights, I didn't cross the threshold until after dark, bone-tired and running on fumes, but this time the work order wrapped up quicker than expected. A sensor at a client site only needed cleaning, not replacement, so what could have been another long night of troubleshooting ended by 6:30. Instead of grabbing a drive-through dinner and heading back out, I punched the mileage into my company truck and made it home around 7:30. For someone used to a routine that ran like clockwork, this was a rare deviation, a subtle shift that would end up pulling back the curtain on more than I was ready for. The second I stepped through the door, I noticed the difference. The kitchen wasn't dark, and the silence I usually walked into wasn't there. Voices floated down the hall. At first, I thought maybe she had music playing, but as I stood still, the tones sharpened into something more intentional. Not laughter, not small talk. This was a conversation with precision, the kind of cadence people use when they're working out details. Curiosity edged past caution. I left my jacket draped on a chair, moved a few steps toward the living room, and froze. From where I stood, I caught snippets, phrases that half-formed before fading into the next. At first, I told myself it had to be something benign. A birthday? A surprise? I stretch to believe that because that's where the mind instinctively goes. Psychologists call it normalcy bias. Your brain protects itself by pushing every odd detail into the "this is fine" folder. It felt safer to assume my wife and her best friend Monica were juggling some mundane plan. My mind tried to paint it wholesome instead of dangerous. Maybe they were planning a trip we'd take after I slowed down at work, or maybe a party tied to some milestone I'd brushed off. Then came the words that shattered the facade. Sarah's voice, low and certain. I need to explore other options. I can't stay stuck if this doesn't work out. Monica didn't hesitate. She started talking about ways to make it easier for her. She used the phrase backup plan, and moments later the two of them were mapping out logistics like they were divvying up tasks for a project. There wasn't room left for interpretation. I wasn't overhearing surprise party ideas. I was listening to the scaffolding of betrayal. It was like hitting a switch. In a matter of seconds, my brain dropped all pretense and accepted the reality. My wife, sitting a room away with her closest friend, was laying groundwork for an affair and an exit path from our marriage. The fact that they were speaking so plainly, without even softening the edges, made it worse. It was deliberate. It wasn't venting. It wasn't joking. It was a strategy session about how my role in her life was nearing replacement. I didn't kick open the door. I didn't shout. I didn't even step closer. Instead, I found myself slowly lowering the unopened beer I'd grabbed from the fridge, setting it on the counter with surprising care, as if any louder sound would give me away. My chest tightened, my ears rang, but I held still. That moment became my defense mechanism. When shock threatened to overwhelm, I retreated inward, buying time to catch up with what I just heard. Instead of confrontation, my body chose withdrawal. There's no mistaking the language of betrayal once you've heard it. Other options. Backup plan. If it doesn't work out. These phrases don't exist in happy marriages, and they don't get smoothed over later by apologies. Monica's role twisted the knife deeper. She wasn't a bystander. She was actively helping, feeding suggestions, turning abstract wishes into tangible steps. I knew then that what I'd stumbled across wasn't hypothetical. It was progress, and I wasn't meant to ever know about it. The weight of the realization sat heavy. For months, I justified my absence with overtime, convinced that long hours meant security and devotion. But from their vantage point, those same hours gave her cover. Reliability at work doubled as invisibility at home. My 70-hour weeks gave her the open space to prepare a new version of her life. I stayed still for only another few seconds before instinct took over. I slipped back out the door, car keys in hand, and drove. I didn't set a destination. I just circled blocks, turned down side streets, let the roads weave under my tires. My hour behind the wheel became the only place I could untangle what I'd heard. The Subaru Fund I'd been sacrificing for felt like a bitter joke. I kept replaying Sarah's tone, Monica's encouragement. Every thought looped back to the same truth. She'd been asking me for reliability in a car while quietly discarding me as her partner. When I finally pulled back into the driveway, the house was quiet. Lights off, no trace of their conversation. From an outside view, nothing seemed changed. But walking through those rooms, the air felt charged, like the walls knew more than they'd show. I slipped into the usual patterns, said nothing, acted as if the night had unfolded normally. But inside, everything had shifted. Silence wasn't apathy, it was calculation. Standing exposed wasn't my best move, patience was. In that choice, I felt the strange strength of restraint. Betrayal doesn't always roar. I learned it often whispers. Quiet sentences hidden between safe words, whispers plotted around kitchen tables. But once you overhear enough, the illusion of normal life fractures for good. I went to bed that night carrying the knowledge like a secret weight. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, the blueprint of my marriage had been redrawn without me. That was the beginning of me living in two overlapping realities. One stayed functional, the tired employee trudging through long days, pretending home life was steady. The other was raw awareness. I'd glimpsed her rehearsal for life after me, and I knew I couldn't unknow it. Every word whispered through that doorway became evidence, not to confront in a burst of emotion, but to steady myself for the future. And that steadying came with its own strange kind of clarity. Because while she was preparing her backup plan, I still had certain protections in place that she seemed to have completely forgotten about. At the time, it felt almost unromantic, even clinical, but later, it would prove to be the one decision that shifted the balance in my favor. The prenup, unexpected superhero. When people talk about superheroes, they usually picture capes, powers, and rescues in the nick of time. In my case, mine wore a suit and existed in black and white legal print. The prenup. Years earlier, when we signed it, I treated the whole thing as uncomfortable but necessary, like adding insurance coverage you hope you'll never need. At the time, it felt flat, overly cautious, but when I overheard my wife laying out her backup plan, that paperwork became the single most valuable thing I had ever brought into the marriage. Here's the simple truth. Our prenup made it clear that my earnings during the marriage, including overtime and savings, remained under my control. That meant the car fund I'd been building through 70-hour weeks wasn't community money she could count on. And because of those terms, I was legally allowed to move every cent into an account with only my name attached. I didn't improvise. I didn't bend rules. I followed exactly what the contract allowed. It was the first financial decision in months that felt like it actually worked in my favor. Signing that prenup never made me feel romantic. Most guys would buy flowers or write some heartfelt promise. I had clauses about asset division. But romance isn't the point of legal documents, it's foresight. At the time, I thought maybe I was overly cautious, maybe even paranoid. My friends ribbed me about it, and even my wife gave a shrug as if she didn't care one way or the other. She signed without putting up a fight, and I tucked it away thinking I'd probably never see it again. But if you've ever watched someone you love prepare an exit with someone else, you know that all illusions of protection vanish fast, unless you actually gave yourself protection in the first place. Once I realized she had been planning her next chapter with Monica's help, I started thinking about what she assumed was hers by default. In her head, all those overtime hours I pulled translated directly into shared funds, her safety net for a new apartment, her stepping stone into independence. That's how marriage is often perceived. What's yours is ours. Except ours doesn't apply when both parties have already agreed, on paper, to different rules. And while she never voiced it out loud, her behavior suggested she had no idea of the limit that contract had placed on her options. The joke I used to make about the prenup being my utility belt ended up sticking. Not because I wanted to feel clever, but because when I thought about what it represented, that analogy wasn't far off. Every overtime payment, every bit of the Subaru Fund was held up as hers in her imagination. But the prenup stripped away the illusion. It turned late nights of overtime into leverage she couldn't touch. She might have been casually talking through her other options, but once the financial side came into play, her options narrowed to almost nothing. What stood out to me wasn't just the legal detail, it was the emotional shift it caused. Betrayal usually puts you into a haze. Most people, when they're blindsided, spin between hurt, anger, and confusion. But the prenup gave me clarity. I already knew she cheated me out of trust and loyalty. At least I didn't have to fear losing financial stability too. So instead of panic, I felt grounded. No fear of courts draining me dry. No anxiety over savings accounts being siphoned. I couldn't stop her choices, but I could stop them from ruining me. That was the difference the prenup gave me. A chance to breathe clearly in a moment that should have flattened me. When she eventually found out, her reaction told me everything. By the time I confronted the truth with paperwork in my hand, she looked less heartbroken than logistical. Her first question wasn't, "Can we fix this?" It was, "What about the money?" She wanted to know if the savings account still existed for her use, if she could access funds to secure her own place. That single line hit harder than any whispered plan I overheard. Her panic wasn't about losing a marriage. It was about losing access to what she thought was her cushion. And that's why I call the prenup the superhero of this whole story. It didn't rescue me with drama or theatrics. It just quietly stripped her of the resources she assumed she had. It flipped the power dynamic without my needing to say a word. She couldn't touch the overtime fund. She couldn't spin years of my work into her soft landing. All the hours I thought were a gift to her car dream were actually preserved for me. She underestimated the boring legal part of our marriage, and that mistake dismantled everything she had been planning in secret. If you've ever sat through a lawyer explaining a prenup, I can almost guarantee you didn't feel much warmth in the process. I sure didn't. But what I failed to appreciate during that meeting years ago was how much future security hides inside those dull clauses. The prenup wasn't there to punish her. It wasn't vengeance. It was balance. It was protection against exactly the kind of casual selfishness she eventually stepped into. Without it, half of my assets would have been on the table, including everything I earned working overtime shifts. With it, she had nothing but shock when the truth came out. I watched her face when she realized it, and in that moment she couldn't disguise what really mattered to her. Not the vows, not the history, not even the Subaru I had nearly ruined myself saving for. What mattered was liquidity, and thanks to foresight, she didn't have it. People always say contracts reveal character. I believe that now. What was revealed to me wasn't love gone wrong. It was love swapped for convenience, now made inconvenient by the one clause she chose to ignore. Plenty of people dismiss prenups as pessimistic, a sign you're already planning for failure. I used to half believe that myself. But after what I saw unfold in my own house, I know better. A prenup doesn't doom a marriage. It doesn't assume failure. It just recognizes the truth. Sometimes people aren't who you think they are, and sometimes the surest gesture of love is protecting your own well-being before trusting it to someone else. Strangely enough, that document did more for me than any vacation photos or anniversary dinners could have. It became the one constant reminder that foresight matters more than wishful thinking. And when betrayal showed itself, the prenup didn't only save my finances, it stopped me from sinking into misplaced fear. It gave me the footing to act decisively and not stall in denial. So yes, in this uneven story about work and betrayal, the prenup earns the cape, signed years earlier than forgotten, only to step into action when everything else unraveled. Not flashy, not romantic, but more powerful than any gesture of devotion I made along the way. And while I could see what the prenup protected me from, I couldn't ignore what it indirectly exposed to, the language she had been using behind my back. I kept replaying her words in my head, and the phrase itself carried its own sting. Exploring options. Polite, vague, almost harmless sounding. But knowing what I knew then, those two words rewrote the entire story of our marriage. Exploring other options while he explores dead scanners. Exploring options. That was the phrase I caught, and it played back in my head with the kind of weight you can't shake off. It wasn't loud or fiery. It was said the way you talk about sampling a new restaurant. No urgency, no guilt, just casual exploration. But behind the soft language was something else. My marriage had been reframed into a menu. Instead of being a partner, I'd been slotted in as one dish among several, something you try until the appetite moves elsewhere. That shift in framing mattered more than the words themselves. It meant stability was no longer assumed. It was contingent on whether something shinier showed up. It hit me almost immediately that this wasn't just idle daydreaming. She wasn't musing into a glass of wine. She was being coached. Monica was right there, nodding like she'd been waiting for this moment. And Monica wasn't just background noise. She was hands-on, treating the situation like a side project. Divorced, working in operations at a healthcare startup, she carried herself like every personal crisis needed a management plan. That night, she played consultant, validating every excuse, supplying new justifications, and even stitching together logistics. She went as far as offering her own apartment as a place for Sarah to clear her head if needed, and promising she'd help arrange introductions if Sarah wanted to see what else was out there. That phrasing stuck because it sounded less like spontaneity and more like project scope. This wasn't venting, it was a coordinated rollout. The harsh humor of it all was impossible to ignore. While Monica poured encouragement and mapped routes toward infidelity from my living room couch, I had been across town, hunched over a stubborn conveyor sensor that refused to read barcodes correctly. In my world, I bent over machines with a flashlight clenched between my teeth, trying to coax broken systems back to life. In theirs, they sat comfortably with glasses of Cabernet, repairing none of the damage but calling it empowerment. 2 different troubleshooting sessions were happening at once, but only one of them threatened to dismantle my whole life. What struck me in the aftermath was the way language coded everything. They never used words like cheating or affair. They spoke in the polished language of growth and self-discovery. Sarah described it as finding out what really brings me joy. Monica pitched it like a career move, as if Sarah were upgrading her role while still drawing on the benefits of the current job. Let's test the waters, see if another partner makes more sense. If not, well, at least you explored. That's how they framed it, like a limited trial. But beneath the euphemism, the reality was simple. I wasn't being offered a choice. I was being demoted to a contingency plan. The weight of that realization dragged on me more than the betrayal itself. Cheating can be confronted, ended, settled. Being treated like a trial subscription, something you could pause or resume without consequence, meant I was never really valued as permanent. My marriage was being tested against newer models, and the results would decide whether I stayed in the house or got shelved. And every time Sarah hesitated, Monica leaned in harder, assuring her she wasn't failing, she was empowered. According to them, empowerment meant sampling partners like appetizers without closing the kitchen behind you. At work, I spent my days preaching dependability. Every sales pitch, Every service call boiled down to the same core promise: stability. The machines we sold had to move boxes predictably and without excuse. That was the metric, reliable or not. And then I'd come home only to find out that dependability had been reclassified as dullness in my personal life. The very trade I'd built my career on, the one I thought counted double in a marriage, was suddenly the flaw disqualifying me. What twisted the knife was realizing she wasn't preparing to replace me outright. She wasn't packing bags. She wasn't filing anything. She was hovering in the gray zone where leaving is optional. It was hedging. If a new man dazzled her, she'd pivot cleanly. If not, she'd drift back to me, armed with a story about needing space and expecting my loyalty to reset us like nothing happened. I could already imagine Monica's lines if the experiment failed. It's normal to test boundaries. What matters is you came back. Reusability had become my role. I wasn't partner material anymore. I was the safety valve. That's where the industrial comedy angle came back to bite me. I had always laughed about the absurd jobs I handled. Resetting scanners, realigning belts, keeping warehouses from collapsing over out-of-sync equipment. I joked that boxes treated me like their superhero, swooping in to prevent chaos. Meanwhile, in my own living room, Sarah and Monica were staging real chaos and dressing it up as self-discovery. Machines didn't lie to me, didn't pretend error codes were opportunities for growth. They broke, and I fixed them. My marriage, on the other hand, performed malfunctions with intentional phrasing designed to lighten the guilt. Reliability, it turned out, was easier to guarantee from conveyors than from someone you thought was committed. Monica's role still stood out most in retrospect. She wasn't neutral support. She wasn't a passive listener. She was an active enabler. She devised cover stories. She offered her home. She encouraged Sarah to treat this like a lifestyle adjustment instead of a betrayal. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't spontaneous passion pulling my wife away. It was influence, nudging her until she felt licensed to act. That was more revealing than anything. People rarely act in a vacuum. Encouragement matters. Support bends decisions. And Sarah had someone in her corner who reframed infidelity into empowerment until it felt justified. I kept circling back to the absurd symmetry. On one side of town, Monica was scripting Sarah's potential exit with wine-fueled confidence. On the other, I was elbow deep in warehouse machinery, trying to coax failing. Sensors back online. Both of us dealt with breakdowns. Both of us thought we were solving critical problems. Yet her guidance dismantled a relationship while mine kept boxes moving in precise order. It was a stark division. I was working to preserve function. She was normalizing dysfunction until it looked like progress. The longer I sat with it, the more the sharp humor dulled into something heavier. There's something uniquely dehumanizing about being treated like the fallback in your own marriage. Not divorced, not abandoned, just parked as a standby while someone else entertained possibilities under the word options. The irony was bitter but clean. I'd invested energy, money, and overtime hours into stability, only to be told loyalty was negotiable. And what she framed as empowerment looked a lot like exploitation when you stripped away the polite words. The night I overheard them, I didn't storm in. I didn't correct the euphemisms or confront Monica's smug encouragement. I stood frozen in the kitchen, parsing each phrase like it was an error code. My instincts told me not to act yet, and maybe that's what saved me. Because acting rashly would have handed them the confrontation they were preparing for, and I would have lost the advantage of awareness. Instead, I forced myself to retreat into silence, holding the knowledge close while I decided what to do next. That silence didn't mean indifference. It meant recalibration. While they were sketching her exit strategy, I was beginning mine. But in that moment, standing in my own house, hearing betrayal framed as personal growth, I realized restraint was my only tool. My reaction wouldn't be loud. My reaction would be quiet, deliberate, and on my terms. And that calm is what carried me into the next stage, where silence itself became the sharpest response I could give. A confrontation that never happened. The strange part about overhearing betrayal is realizing how much you've been conditioned to expect drama. Movies make it look easy. You catch someone cheating, and immediately you blow up their spot with a scene worthy of a season finale. But real life doesn't always go that route. When it happened to me, I didn't burst into the living room. I didn't throw accusations or demand answers. I chose a restraint. No confrontation. Not that night, not the next morning. Instead, I let silence become the plan. That meant slipping through routine like nothing had changed. Outwardly, I stuck to the same rhythms. Get up, head to work, answer calls, come home late, collapse into bed. Inwardly, though, I was charting a quieter course. Within days, I moved our savings into an account with only my name on it. Per the prenup, that money was protected. And by Thursday, less than 72 hours after overhearing that conversation, I was speaking with a divorce attorney. Calm, systematic, paperwork-driven. My marriage had shifted into an exit procedure and my wife didn't even know it. I think back to those nights after the overhear and laugh at the sheer normalcy of how it looked. To anyone watching, it was routine, two people in bed, each scrolling on a phone, lights out. But the truth was layered. She was messaging friends, catching up on feeds. I was revisiting her words, exploring options, backup plan, like they were errors flashing on a broken scanner I couldn't ignore. The absurdity sat heavy, 3 feet apart, living as if nothing had ruptured, when one of us already knew the math didn't balance. What surprised me most was my reaction. I didn't feel powerless. Keeping quiet actually made me feel in control. If I had confronted her on the spot, I know what would have happened. She would have denied everything, twisted it into paranoia, and pointed to my long work hours as proof I was spiraling. That's a playbook as old as betrayal itself. But silence denied her the script. By holding still, I forced the story to unfold on my timeline. Ordinary conversation became dramatic irony. She thought she had the upper hand, while I was already pulling out paperwork she couldn't touch. It echoes my job in ways I didn't expect. Debugging scanners and conveyor sensors requires patience. Push the wrong button too fast, and you lock the whole machine. Wait, watch, gather signals, and eventually the error shows itself. Sitting in my own house, coexisting with her nightly phone scrolls, I applied the same rule. I didn't push. I read the signals. And sure enough, they confirmed the breakdown. My evenings took on a dual life. Outwardly, I came home from work and made small talk, dinners reheated in the microwave, jokes about sales calls gone wrong, nods at her reminders about groceries. Inwardly, I was running what felt like 2 overlapping projects. Her project, encouraged by Monica, was about testing other options. Mine was more straightforward, getting my finances secured, documenting what I knew, initiating the paperwork that would end us. No yelling, no accusations, just quiet safeguards stacking up behind the scenes. The surreal part was playing the role of the unaware husband at dinner. She'd tell me about her day, laugh about some yoga class mishap, talk casually about car repairs. I responded like nothing was wrong. But inside, I knew. I knew she believed her plan was hidden, that her whispers were safe. That asymmetry, her blindness versus my knowledge, created a rhythm that was bizarrely funny in its cruelty. It felt like living in a sitcom where one character has read ahead in the script while the other keeps delivering lines in the dark. Humor crept in because it had to. The contrast was too sharp. At work, I was literally fixing breakdowns for a living, scanners that misfired, belts that jammed, systems that failed until repaired properly. Then I come home and lie down next to a completely different kind of breakdown, one I couldn't fix with tools or manuals. Industrial equipment at least rewards effort. Marriages, at least mine, don't always. The irony kept me up at night, but it also steered me away from confrontation. Why scream at the broken machine when you can quietly prepare to replace it altogether? The real revelation was understanding silence as strategy, not weakness. Every day I didn't confront didn't mean I was afraid. It meant I wanted her confidence to grow so she wouldn't see the shift coming. Every day she assumed I was clueless was another day I secured my accounts, clarified my legal standing, and built the scaffolding of the divorce. Her certainty became my cover. She thought I was still locked into the grind, blind to her late-night confidences. In truth, I was sharpening my advantage. You might think there was bitterness in those nights, but mostly there was clarity. I didn't carry guilt or self-blame. Those hours lying still, hearing her type away on her phone, just underscored what I'd already realized. The damage was deeper than a single word in the living room. I wasn't losing her loyalty that week. It had been gone long before. I was only just catching up. And catching up meant halting the instinct to explode and instead funneling energy into decisions that actually mattered. Staying in sync with routine gave me a peculiar kind of invisibility. To her, nothing was off. To me, everything was rewriting itself. It was like two parallel realities playing out in the same room. She believed she was planning options. I was already securing the one option that mattered to me, leaving on steady ground without giving her an opening to grab at resources that weren't hers. The comedy in it all remains that I wasn't gasping at betrayal the way you'd think. The real jokes were practical. Bank transfers done quietly in the afternoon between sales calls. A Thursday appointment for the divorce attorney scheduled on my lunch break as if it were just another client consult. Paperwork downloaded, filled out, slid into a folder I kept tucked in my work bag. I walked through those steps the way I'd walk through a machine check. Systematic. No screams, no tears, just procedure. On the surface, we were still a functioning couple. Sharing space, eating dinners, exchanging trivial conversation. But behind it, every part of me had shifted. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was her silent opponent stacking moves. And she didn't see it because she didn't think silence had teeth. That's the heart of why the confrontation never happened. There was nothing to gain from yelling, nothing to stabilize from demanding answers. I had already heard enough. The evidence had spoken louder than any excuse could. What mattered wasn't hearing her spin a defense. What mattered was preparing quietly so her defense never had a chance to start. Those days in silence weren't easy, but they clarified one truth: the most decisive moves don't have to be loud. Sometimes the strongest retaliation is redirection. And as my preparations were nearing completion, it became less about sitting with betrayal and more about timing the reveal. Because silence only holds so long. And when the moment finally arrived, the reveal didn't come with shouting. It came with paperwork slipped across a table in the middle of an otherwise ordinary evening. She thought she was walking into a night like any other, carrying dinner in her hands. She didn't yet realize I was carrying something heavier, something final. 10. Plot twist. Divorce papers served with takeout. She came through the front door with takeout bags swinging from her hands, moving like someone rehearsing a return to normal. Her expression carried that too easy smile, like traffic had been annoying, but dinner would smooth it out, like a carton of lo mein, and a shared couch could reset months of tension. What she didn't realize was that the evening wasn't set around food. It was set around a conclusion I'd already prepared. The staging could have been pulled from a sitcom. She dropped the bags on the counter, talked about construction delays she hit on the highway, riffed about a coworker's quirk, and did just enough small talk to fill the silence. The rhythm felt deliberate, her version of breadcrumbing me back into routine. It was familiar, calculated, practiced. But instead of reaching for the plates, I reached for the envelope waiting nearby, the manila edge already creased from how long I'd kept it ready. The humor was quiet but sharp. Cartons of sweet and sour chicken, placed on the same table as sworn legal documents. I slid it in front of her mid-movement, interrupting the act in motion. No speech, no overture, just an envelope dropped into the flow of her script. She stopped, hands shaking enough that a paper bag crackled, and stared at it like she couldn't categorize the prop. In her head, the scene was reconciliation. On mine, it was resolution. She opened the flap, and the word divorce in bold type did all the talking. There's no way to fully describe the mix of comedy and bitterness and what came next. All her banter evaporated instantly, all her practiced ease gone. No tears, no denial. Her first instinct was tighter, immediate, and telling. She asked about money. Did I really move the savings into my own account? Did the prenup actually mean she couldn't touch the overtime fund? The same car fund I'd bled 70-hour weeks to build, that $12,000 I stacked shift by shift, was the very piece she assumed would cushion her. And I'd legally placed it out of reach weeks earlier. In that moment, her priorities were louder than any explanation could be. This wasn't heartbreak. It wasn't mourning vows or reflecting on choices. It was logistics. Questions about rent, deposits, what she could access, what she couldn't. Watching her scramble over numbers instead of emotion confirmed it all. The betrayal I overheard wasn't a lapse, it was a calculation. And seeing her, realize the prenup cut off her last assumption felt like the actual turning point in the room. The humor came less from levity than from irony. She had walked in with plastic containers meant to comfort, maybe thinking the return could be smoothed over with soy sauce packets and movie talk. Instead, she ended up staring at notarized pages that closed the door. The food sat untouched, cooling while she cycled through questions about money flowing into my account. The scene was absurd for its contrast. Orange chicken cooling beside a petition for dissolution stapled neatly in black and white. I let the silence do the work. No accusations about Monica. No replay of her words. No shouting. Just paperwork on the table, steady as gravity, while she tried to insert arguments into the empty air. The envelope itself stripped her of momentum. Confrontations give room for denial or twisting. This left nothing. Every question she tossed landed on legal certainty. She wanted reasons. I didn't give them. She wanted space to pivot. I didn't allow it. The prenup filled the silence better than I ever could. Her demeanor fell into something almost mechanical. After the first shock wore down, she leaned back, mind clearly racing to new calculations. Housing options, car loans, splitting schedules. It had all the drama of a project update meeting, except the project was our dismantled marriage. And the absurdity of her methodical tone, paired against a backdrop of fried rice neither of us touched, turned the whole moment surreal. She wasn't apologizing. She was resource mapping. Her marriage vocabulary had shifted into budgeting language before the takeout had even cooled. The clarity of that outcome was satisfying in its own grim way. I'd prepared for the reveal not to win points, not for vengeance, but to protect myself. The prenup made the car fund untouchable. The savings were already separated into my account. The shift had already occurred before she walked through the door. Her shock wasn't at betrayal being exposed, but at realizing every resource she expected to lean on had been strategically removed. All I did was hand her certainty. That certainty ate the air in the room. She still tried for lightness at first, half jokes about me being rash, half offers to talk it through first. But without money to access and without control of the narrative, those gestures collapsed. She needed confrontation to regain control. Silence gave her none. And as she sat across from me, chopsticks idle in her hand, her composure drained into frustration. By the end of the night, the food was still stacked in cartons, the soy sauce packets unopened. The marriage she thought could reset had been reduced not with screaming, but with documents formalizing what was already decided. Watching her recognize the permanence of those papers was the real comedy. She hadn't been fighting for us. She'd been fighting for her footing. And footing was gone. That was the truth of sliding the divorce papers across that cheap wooden table. It wasn't performance. It wasn't revenge. It was the quiet end of the script, one I had prepared carefully while she was writing hers in hushed voices with Monica. She rehearsed return. I prepared departure. And when it played out, only one version could stand. The untouched food sat there as the last symbol. She walked in expecting a shared meal and talk about our future. What she got was a closed ledger, a prenup enforcing itself, and table space that showed exactly how far apart we already lived. That was the point, not theatrics, just proof. The decision had been made and set in legal print, and from that moment, the performances ended. She had thought she could drift back in with charm and timing. Instead, she faced silence and a signature line. What happened next wasn't relief or grief. It was watching the scripted confidence unravel in ways she hadn't anticipated. The emotional roller coaster he didn't buy tickets for. After the envelope landed on the table, the aftermath unfolded less like one dramatic scene and more like a sequence of shifting faces. What started as defiance swung quickly into panic, and from there it rolled through a familiar set of tactics. It wasn't one clean reaction. It was a cycle. Apologies, bargaining, theatrics, and finally, ploys that pushed past reason. It was an emotional roller coaster I never asked to stand in line for. The first turn came almost immediately. The same woman who had demanded space just weeks before began pleading for the opposite. Suddenly, she wanted couples counseling, date nights, weekends together like old times. She rehearsed well-worn lines. It doesn't have to end like this. We've been through too much, and let's just start over. The words sounded polished, as though she had practiced them in the mirror. But I knew better. You don't beg for reconciliation out of love after you've already started laying out backup plans. Her desperation wasn't about repairing us. It was about salvaging her future as it unraveled faster than she expected. Apologies followed in waves. At the dinner table. In late-night whispers. Even scrawled on sticky notes she left in the kitchen, telling me she was sorry, that she got confused, that she lost sight of things. At first glance, this might have looked like remorse, but the more she spoke, the clearer it became. She wasn't sorry about betraying me. She was sorry about where it had landed her. Nobody cries about consequences the way they cry about guilt, and it took all of 5 minutes to tell the difference. Then came the analogies in my head that stuck cruelly well. I kept thinking of TV streaming apps, the way people pause one show, test out another, maybe delete it, and then scroll back to the original if nothing else sticks. That's how she treated the marriage. I was content stored under continue watching. Disposable in practice, retrievable if the experiment failed. Hearing her pitch another try sounded less like reconciliation and more like asking to restart a mid-season episode. I couldn't unsee it, and in that moment, the metaphor did more truth-telling than her actual words. When the softer tactics failed, she escalated. Calls came pouring in from Monica, as if she were reheating old lines to sound convincing again. Suddenly, Monica was pushing for mediation, urging me to pause the paperwork. She layered her voice over my wife's pleas, tag-teaming the attempts at stalling. To anyone else, it might have looked like support. To me, it sounded like the person who helped sketch the exit plan trying to erase her fingerprints from it. Every call only underlined what I already knew. This wasn't care, it was damage control. Reconciliation appeals soon gave way to manipulation. That's when she went beyond crying and into interference. I got a call from HR at my office. Someone had called anonymously about my emotional stability, suggesting they should check in on me during a divorce. It was thinly veiled sabotage, the kind of thing you expect in a bad sitcom. Around the same week, a neighbor mentioned that a social worker had stopped by the street asking questions about my household. The description? A woman matching Monica. False concern disguised as professionalism, weaponized to slow me down. Each new tactic landed like clockwork, another loop on the roller coaster, wild but predictable. And then came the lowest point in the sequence, the pregnancy claim. Dropped mid-conversation, served like it was a trump card. She presented it not with sincerity, but with timing too exact to miss. The goal was obvious, to press pause, to make me hesitate, to trap me in state-mandated obligations that might slow the divorce. The words were carefully chosen, yet her delivery felt off, more rehearsed than shocked. I kept calm, the way I would with a stalling machine, asked for proof, outlined the steps. Doctor confirmation. Appointments. Paperwork. A week later, the claim collapsed. No pregnancy. Just another tactic wasted. And with that, the last shred of credibility evaporated. Betrayal is one thing. Fabrication on that scale? It cements finality. Coinciding with this unraveling, the yoga studio man she'd involved in her options reached out to me directly. His message was brief but revealing. He apologized, claimed he hadn't known she was married. His tone was defensive, yet factual. He didn't want involvement in their drama, and certainly not in mine. That moment hit harder than any of her begging. While she spun us upward, others quietly exposed them downward. Her other option dissolved into embarrassment, which only amplified the panic she aimed back my way. In the following weeks, her attempts doubled back over themselves. She tried contacting our mortgage company, vague in her explanations, framing herself as still co-managing accounts. She texted more apologies, sprinkled with promises about new beginnings. It all bled together, like watching someone shuffle cards from a deck that never changes. I had already seen every tactic she tried to play. None surprised me anymore. Seeing the full arc laid out in a timeline made clear what had felt chaotic when living through it. First came the begging and apologies, then Monica's interference, then the desperate escalation through HR and impersonations, then the false pregnancy, finally the collapse of her affair once the yoga studio man confronted his own ignorance. Every stage was less about me and more about keeping her scaffolding intact. She treated marriage like convenience. When the convenience disappeared, she clawed. But clawing doesn't equal commitment any more than crying equals change. By then, I had already shifted into strict practicality. The money stayed where it was, untouchable under the prenup. The paperwork moved forward, signed, and filed. Each call, each incident, each fabricated claim failed to alter the outcome. My silence became stronger than words. I didn't argue her points, didn't indulge her timelines. I just let her actions collapse under their own weight. The lesson in all of it became clearer the longer the ride dragged on. Genuine remorse accepts fault with humility. What I faced was regret born entirely out of being caught. Regret for the consequences, not the intentions. Her emotional roller coaster looked powerful up close. But in the grand sweep of things, it was just noise wrapped in manipulation. None of it touched the base truth. Once you hear someone planning their life options without you, their tears afterward don't matter. And so, what might have been the hardest weeks turned into the plainest recognition. I wasn't abandoning someone I'd failed. I was stepping away from someone who had already demoted me to standby. Her roller coaster carried chaos loops and false drops, but the tracks only circled back on themselves. Mine was linear. Forward, out. That clarity didn't erase the sting, but it did cut through the haze. Each frantic tactic only confirmed the decision I had already made the night I overheard her words. And every failed scheme, from fake apologies to invented pregnancies, proved that nothing of substance remained. It's strange, but when you map the whole sequence, the most exhausting thing about the ride isn't betrayal itself. It's realizing how much of your energy had been wasted sitting on a track you never chose. And once you're off, the air feels steadier, even if your legs still shake a little. Because if there's any lesson hidden in those shifts, it's this. The real cost wasn't money or time. It was the toll of watching someone you trusted to love like a business plan. And that recognition is what shaped what came next. Sometimes the dullest overtime shift ends up teaching the hardest lesson. For me, it wasn't just long hours for a new car. It was the chain of events that exposed everything else. I worked weeks of 70-hour shifts to build a $12,000 Subaru Fund, only to come home early one night and overhear her planning other options. That was the moment I moved the savings into accounts she couldn't touch, leaned on the prenup, and filed for divorce before she had the chance to rewrite the story. In the end, the choice was simple. Self-respect matters more than sacrifice wasted on someone else's agenda. If this reminds you of a time you put in effort only to have it thrown away, share it in the comments. And if stories like this resonate, consider subscribing. You'll hear plenty more.